Welcome back to the Brave Herd. At 3:47 a.m., the emergency room doors of a small Texas hospital near Fort Hood slammed open, both of them hard. The sound cracked through the silence of the night shift like a rifle shot, and every nurse, every orderly, every person standing in that corridor looked up at exactly the same moment. The rain had been falling over central Texas for 4 hours straight. Cold, heavy, relentless rain that soaked through everything it touched and made the night feel older and darker than it had any right to be. 2 U.S. Army soldiers came through the doors first. Their uniforms were soaked through. Their boots left dark, wet prints across the white floor tiles with every step they took. Their faces were tight and focused, carrying the kind of expression that people wear when they are holding fear down by sheer force of will. Between them, they carried a stretcher, and on that stretcher lay Sergeant First Class Daniel Mercer, 38 years old, 4th Infantry Division, 2 combat deployments to Afghanistan, a soldier's soldier. The kind of man his unit described quietly as dependable. The kind of man who never asked anyone to carry something he would not carry himself. He was unconscious. His left side was wrapped in field dressing that had soaked through completely, dark red bleeding into the gauze. Shrapnel wounds from a live training exercise gone catastrophically wrong. Still raw and open beneath the bandaging. His face was pale. Too pale. The kind of pale that made experienced nurses move without being told. The trauma team was already stepping forward, and then they stopped because the first thing every person in that emergency room noticed was not the blood. It was not the soldiers. It was not even the stretcher. It was a dog, running alongside that stretcher stride for stride, soaking wet from the rain outside, was a German shepherd. Large, powerfully built, tan and black coat pressed flat against his body from the water. Amber eyes locked onto the man on the stretcher with an intensity that made the air in that room feel different, heavier, charged with something nobody in that corridor could quite name. His name was Lex, and he had not left Daniel Mercer's side in 4 years. Not once. Not ever. They had deployed together twice to the mountains of Afghanistan, sleeping on the same ground, breathing the same cold night air, trusting each other in the kind of darkness where trust is the only thing standing between a man and everything that wants to take him down. In Helmont Province, during a convoy ambush that never made into any newspaper, Lex had pulled Mercer from a burning vehicle by the collar of his jacket, dragging him 30 feet across open, scorched ground through smoke and heat that would have stopped most animals completely cold. Lex had collapsed from the effort afterward, his paws burned, his chest heaving from the heat. But Mercer had been clear of the fire. Mercer had woken up in a field hospital 2 days later. The first thing he saw was Lex lying on the floor beside his cot, chin flat on the ground, amber eyes watching the door with quiet, unwavering patience. Through cracked lips and a throat raw from smoke, Mercer had whispered, "You stayed." Lex had lifted his head, looked at him once with those steady amber eyes, and put his chin back down. That was the kind of partnership they had built. Not handler and dog, brothers. And tonight, in this bright antiseptic-smelling emergency room in central Texas, Lex did not understand shrapnel wounds. He did not understand surgical procedure or trauma protocol, or why all these strangers in white and blue were reaching toward a soldier with their hands. But he understood one thing with every instinct 4 years of combat training had ever built into him. His soldier was hurt, and nobody was going to touch him. The moment the first doctor reached toward the stretcher, Lex moved between them. Smooth, immediate, no hesitation. His body dropped low, shoulders rolling forward, and a growl rose from somewhere deep in his chest. Not loud, not wild, not the sound of confused or frightened animal. Controlled, focused, final. The kind of growl that anyone who has ever worked alongside military dogs recognizes immediately as the last warning before action. The trauma team pulled back instinctively. A security officer near the entrance reached for his radio. Another took 2 slow, careful steps forward, his hand moving toward his belt. One of the Army soldiers holding the stretcher said, his voice low and tight, "Do not approach the dog. Do not approach him." Everyone froze. The room held its breath, and for 10 long, terrible seconds, the only sounds in that hospital were the rain driving hard against the windows, the distant beep of a monitor somewhere down the hall, and the steady, unwavering growl of a German shepherd named Lex, who had decided that this room was a battlefield, and his soldier was not going to be touched by anyone he did not trust. Daniel Mercer was bleeding. He was losing time, and nobody in that room could reach him. That was when Claire Bennett set her clipboard down on the nurse's station counter and walked forward. She was 41 years old, blonde hair pulled back tight, no makeup, blue scrubs. The kind of quiet in her eyes that only comes from having already lived through the worst thing life can do to a person, and choosing every single morning to get up and keep going anyway. She walked toward Lex slowly, not rushing, not reaching, not speaking yet. She came down on both knees on the cold floor tiles right there in the middle of that emergency room with every doctor and nurse and soldier watching her in complete silence, and she looked at Lex directly and calmly. Lex shifted his amber gaze to her face. The growl continued, but his eyes moved over her the way combat dogs assess everything, reading her body, her breath, her stillness, looking for something familiar in a room full of strangers. Claire did not flinch. She did not reach for him. She held his gaze steady and quiet. And then she leaned forward slightly and spoke in a voice so low that the nurses standing closest to her would later say they had to hold their own breath just to hear it. "Brave heart," she whispered. Lex's ears shifted forward. "Warrior, rest." The growl faded. "Come home." The room went absolutely silent. Lex blinked once. His body, which had been coiled and forward and ready for action, slowly lowered. His shoulders dropped. His head came down, and then he walked the 2 steps to the edge of the stretcher and pressed his forehead gently, carefully against Daniel Mercer's chest. And he stayed there. Not one person in that emergency room spoke. Not one person moved. Every doctor, every nurse, every soldier and security officer standing in that corridor stared at Claire Bennett with the same expression on their faces, because nobody there knew those words. Nobody had ever heard that phrase. It was not standard military K-9 protocol. It was not written in any handling manual or any training document that existed on record. It was a recall phrase created quietly within a classified Special Operations K-9 unit in Afghanistan, used briefly within that unit, and then retired from any official record years before most of the people standing in that room had ever worn a uniform. Nobody should have known it. Nobody except the people who were there. The trauma team exchanged one look. Then they moved because Daniel Mercer was running out of time. And now, finally, they could reach him. Lex stayed pressed low beside the stretcher as the doctors worked around him, as the 4 lines went in, and the monitors were attached, and the nurses moved with the quick practiced urgency that emergency medicine demands. He did not interfere. He did not growl again. He simply stayed beside his soldier, forehead low, amber eyes tracking every movement in that room, watching, waiting, trusting for the first time since those doors had slammed open that these people were trying to help. They moved Mercer into surgery at 4:19 a.m. Lex was not allowed inside the operating room. He laid down outside the door. He did not move for 2 hours. He lay on that cold corridor floor with his chin on his paws and his amber eyes fixed on the door that stood between him and his soldier. And he waited with particular heartbreaking patience of an animal that does not fully understand time, but understands loyalty with every fiber of its being. Claire brought him water at 4:45 a.m. He did not drink it. She sat down beside him on the floor, her back against the wall, and stayed there for a few quiet minutes. She did not try to pet him. She did not try to comfort him with words he could not understand. She just sat beside him, the way you sit beside someone who is afraid and cannot say, "So, he's strong," she said quietly after a while. "He is going to fight." Lex did not look at her, but he did not move away either. At 5:32 a.m., the monitor inside the operating room screamed. The sound cut through the door and through the corridor, and through every nerve in Claire's body like something sharp, cold. She was on her feet before she had made the decision to stand. Through the small window in the operating room door, she could see the team moving fast, hear the surgeon's voice rising above the alarm, sharp and controlled. "Charge clear." The paddles came down. The monitor screamed again. And then came the sound that nobody in that hospital would ever forget for the rest of their working lives. From a floor beside the door, Lex lifted his head and he cried. Not a bark, not aggression, not the sound of a dog reacting to noise or alarm. It was a long, low, broken, trembling sound that rose from somewhere beneath training and discipline and 4 years of combat conditioning. It was grief, pure and raw, and completely unguarded. He rose from the floor and pressed himself against the operating room door, both large paws flat against the surface, his forehead pressed hard to the wood, and that broken cry still coming from deep in his chest. And then he began to push. Not aggressive, not wild, desperate, as though if he could just get through that door, if he could just reach his soldier, if he could just be beside him, everything would be all right, as though he believed with everything inside him that his presence alone was enough to bring Mercer back. Claire dropped to the floor beside him immediately, both arms around his harness, holding him gently but firmly, her cheek pressed against the side of his wet, trembling head. "Lex," she said softly. "Lex, listen to me." He pushed against the door again, that broken cry still coming. "He is fighting," Claire said, her voice steady even as her own eyes filled. "Right now on the other side of that door. He is fighting with everything he has. You have to let him fight." Lex made that sound one more time, quieter and then slowly, like something giving way deep inside him. He stopped pushing. He stood against that door with Claire's arms around him, and he trembled, not from cold, not from fear, from something far, deeper and far older than either. Inside the operating room, the paddles came down a second time. The monitors screamed a third time, and then at 5:34 a.m., Sergeant First Class Daniel Mercer's heart came back. Slow at first, then steadier, then strong. The monitor found its rhythm and held it. The surgeon exhaled one long breath. In the corridor outside that door, Lex went still. He pulled back slowly from the door. He turned once in a small, tight circle, the way dogs do when their body has understood something their mind is still catching up to, and then he lay back down on the cold floor, put his chin on his paws, and closed his amber eyes. 2 nurses standing at the far end of the corridor were quietly wiping their faces. Neither of them said a single word. Claire sat back down on the floor beside Lex, her back against the wall, her knees pulled up, and she closed her own eyes and let out a breath that felt like it had been living inside her chest for 7 years. Because this was not the first time she had sat beside a military dog outside a closed door and waited. 7 years ago in a forward operating base in Kandahar, Afghanistan, she had sat beside a different dog outside a different door. And that time a man on the other side had not come back. His name was Captain James Bennett, her husband. He had led a night rescue mission into an active ambush in Kandahar, going back and open fire to reach a wounded young specialist who had been pinned down and cut off when his unit was overrun and forced to fall back. That young specialist's name was Daniel Mercer. James had found him in the dark, in the dirt, bleeding and barely conscious, and he had lifted him onto his back and carried him across open ground with rounds cutting through the air above them both, and he had delivered him to safety with his own hands. And then he had gone back into that ambush because there were others still out there. Captain James Bennett did not come home from that second run. Claire had been serving in a support role with a classified Ranger task unit at the time, close enough to the operation to know exactly what had happened, close enough to feel every second of it, and completely unable to do anything about it. She had left the military 8 months later, not from weakness. She had left because she looked at the growing stack of condolence letters on her commanding officer's desk one morning and realized with a clarity that felt like ice water that she could not write one more. She had gone to nursing school instead. She had taken a position at a hospital near Fort Hood because she wanted to stay close to soldiers even when she could no longer serve beside them. She had told herself every morning that it was enough. Most mornings she almost believed it. The night before James deployed for the very last time, they had sat together on the small porch of their rented house outside Fayetteville, and he had told her about the canine recall phrase his unit used in the field. He had made her memorize it. She had asked him why. He had smiled in that quiet, certain way he had, the way that always made her feel like he knew something about the future that she did not. And he had said simply, because you never know when knowing the right words will matter. She had not understood it then. She had carried those 6 words for 7 years. She had never used them until tonight. Mercer was moved to the ICU at 7:15 a.m. He regained consciousness slowly, the way people do after serious surgery, surfacing in fragments, pieces of awareness assembling themselves carefully one at a time. The first thing he felt was a familiar weight against the edge of his bed. He opened his eyes. Lex had his chin resting on the mattress, positioned with careful precision to avoid the bandaging, his amber eyes watching Mercer's face with an expression that any person who has ever truly loved a dog would recognize without needing to explain to them. Mercer looked at him for a long moment. His throat was dry. His body felt distant and heavy. His voice came out rough and barely above a whisper. "You stayed," he said. Lex pressed his forehead gently against Mercer's hand. And then came the sound. That deep, slow, trembling exhale that is not quite a whimper and not quite a cry, but something in between. The sound of an animal releasing hours of terror in a single quiet breath. The sound of relief, so complete it has no other way to leave the body. Mercer closed his eyes. His fingers moved slowly, carefully through Lex's fur. "I told you," he whispered softly. "We go home together." Claire was standing in the doorway. She had come to check on the patient. She had not planned to stay, but she stood in that doorway in the pale early morning light and watched the soldier and his dog hold each other in the wordless, irreplaceable way that only beings who've been through something real together ever can. And she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight and locked and quietly aching for 7 years. Mercer turned his head slowly and looked toward the door. His eyes, still heavy from surgery, moved over her face, and then they stopped. Something shifted in his expression, something that went beyond recognition, something deeper. "You were at Kandahar," he said. Claire went very still. "You were with the Ranger unit," Mercer said. His voice was weak but certain, the certainty of a man who has carried a memory so long it has become part of him. "I remember your face after they brought me in." He paused. The room was very quiet. "Your husband," he said softly. "He carried me." Claire did not speak for a moment. "I wrote you a letter," Mercer said, "from the hospital. I attended his funeral on a screen because I couldn't walk yet. I needed you to know that I was there, that I knew what he did." "I know," Claire said. Her voice was steady. She had practiced being steady for 7 years. "I have that letter with me," she said quietly. "Every shift, every single one." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were tired and grateful, and full of something that had no clean name. "He saved my life," Mercer said. "And now you did." Claire shook her head gently. "You saved your own life. You fought." She paused for just a moment. "James would have expected nothing less from you." She stepped back from the doorway. She left that moment exactly where it belonged, in that quiet room between a soldier, a German shepherd, and the memory of a man who had carried strangers through fire and never once considered anything other than his duty. 3 weeks later, on a cool and bright Tuesday morning, Sergeant First Class Daniel Mercer walked out the front doors of that small Texas hospital near Fort Hood. Slowly, left arm in a sling, right hand steady at his side. Lex walked beside him, head up, stride measured and proud, as though he was escorting the most important person in the world to the most important door either of them had ever walked through. There was no ceremony waiting outside, no band, no parade, no cameras or reporters. Just a small, quiet group of soldiers from Mercer's unit standing in the parking lot, hands clasped in front of them, backs straight, the way soldiers stand when they're trying very hard not to show how relieved they are to see someone still standing. A young private, barely 20 years old, broke from the group and walked forward and knelt down in front of Lex. He looked at the German shepherd for a long, quiet moment. Then he said softly, "You're a good soldier." Mercer looked down at Lex. The corner of his mouth moved. "He's better than most of us," he said. Before he got into the waiting vehicle, Mercer stopped. He turned back toward the hospital entrance. Claire was standing just inside the glass doors. She had 4 minutes before her next shift began. She always had another shift beginning. Mercer looked at her through the glass for a moment, and then he raised his right hand in a salute. Not the crisp, formal salute of military protocol and ceremony. Something slower, something quieter, something that carried 7 years of weight and gratitude and grief and survival in a single unhurried gesture. Claire returned it softly. The vehicle pulled away from the curb. Lex put his head out the window immediately, amber eyes fixed on the hospital entrance, watching it grow smaller and smaller as the vehicle moved down the road. He watched it until it disappeared completely from view. Claire stood at the glass doors for a moment after the vehicle was gone, and the parking lot was quiet again. Then she turned around and walked back inside. Another patient was waiting. Another family was frightened. Another shift was beginning. No medals would come for what she had done that night. No headlines would carry her name. No ceremony would ever mark the moment she had knelt on a cold emergency room floor at 3:47 in the morning and whispered 6 words that her husband had given her on a porch in Fayetteville and that she had carried alone for 7 years until the exact moment they were needed. But as she walked back through those doors, back to the work that had no end and asked for nothing in return, Claire Bennett felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. She felt James walking beside her, not in grief, not in loss, in purpose. He had carried a wounded soldier through fire so that soldier could live, and that soldier had lived long enough to come back to her hospital in the middle of the night. And because of that, she had been exactly where she needed to be with exactly the words she needed to have at exactly the right moment. Nothing about that felt like coincidence. Some soldiers fight wars. Some survive them. And some, like Claire Bennett, choose every single day to walk back through the doors and quietly heal what war leaves behind. That is not a lesser kind of courage. That is a different kind. The kind that doesn't make the headlines. The kind that shows up in the rain at 3:47 in the morning, gets down on both knees on a cold floor, and says the right words at the right moment to a grieving dog guarding a dying soldier. The kind of courage this country has always been built on. The kind we must never forget. If this story moved something in you tonight, if it reminded you what loyalty looks like, what sacrifice looks like, and what love looks like when it absolutely refuses to quit, then take just a moment right now and type the word honor in the comment below, because the men and women in these stories deserve to know that someone is still listening, that someone still remembers. If you are watching State of Valor for the first time tonight, please subscribe right now, because every single week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories of real courage, real sacrifice, real Americans who gave everything they had and asked for nothing in return. They carried this nation on their backs. The very least we can do is carry their memory forward. This is State of Valor, and we will see you in the next one.